Good afternoon and welcome to Writing Climate Change. My name is Nicoletta Pireddu. I'm the inaugural director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. Under the auspices of Georgetown College, this initiative promotes interdisciplinary collaborations across departments for research, pedagogy, and public-facing projects that demonstrate the enduring value of the humanities for the understanding of the human condition. Tonight's event is the fourth and last of our Voices on the Environment series at the intersection of science, arts, and the humanities. And this is the first run of what will become, hopefully, a yearly series of interdisciplinary events celebrating the Earth at Georgetown. Voices on the Environment is the result of a partnership between the Humanities Initiative and two other units on campus. The Environment Initiative, directed by Professor Peter Mara, whom I thank for his collaboration. It is an internationally recognized home for innovative education, groundbreaking research, and transformative action on the environment and sustainability here at Georgetown. And the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics, a joint initiative of the School of Foreign Service and Georgetown College, with a mission to harness the power of performance to humanize global politics and to cast critical issues in a new light, including the environment. I wish to thank co-director Professor Derek Goldman for joining our project. A few more expressions of gratitude to Professor Nathan Hensley for his precious input and participation, to our student Alexandra Baumann for her conceptualization of our poster and her phenomenal patience with the too many requests for editing. To the college Zoom team, in particular Lynn Ellis and Candace Mosley, for their constant support, and to the Georgetown College for endorsing our programs. Tonight's roundtable will focus on the meaning and role of writing in our understanding of the environment and of climate change. Three distinguished literary and cultural critics will reflect on the relationship with writing in their respective scholarly domains. What difference do genre and mode make in thinking about our environmental crisis and its repair? Beyond mere transmission of scientific ideas, can language, emplotment, and imagination rewire affective circuits, reorient our historical consciousness and our sense of social justice, and recalibrate our relationship with the environment? I am delighted to introduce our guests in alphabetical order, which is also the order in which they will first speak. Sukanya Banerjee is Associate Professor of English at the University of California, Berkeley. She works on the literature and culture of Victorian Britain and its empire in the framework of colonial and post-colonial studies, ecology, transnationalism, and diaspora. Her book, Becoming Imperial Citizens, Indians in the Late Victorian Empire, was awarded the Sonia Rudikoff Prize for Best First Book in Victorian Studies. She's a co-editor of New Routes in Diaspora Studies and is currently working on a book-length project on Victorian eco-colonialisms. Additional work on environmental issues include her essays Ecologies of Cotton in 19th Century Contexts, Ecology, Drama, and the Ground of Empire, the play of Indigo, in the volume Ecological Form, System and Aesthetics in the Age of Empire, and Who or What is Victorian? Ecology, Indigo, and the Trans-Imperial in Victorian Studies. Ursula Heise is professor in the Department of English and at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. Her research and teaching focus on contemporary literature, environmental culture in the Americas, Western Europe, and Japan, narrative and media theory, literature and science fiction. Her books include Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, the environmental imagination of the global, Imagining Extinction, the cultural meanings of endangered species, and the co-edited volume, The Routledge Companion to the Environmental Humanities. Professor Heise is also the editor of the book series Literatures, Cultures, and the Environment at Palgrave Macmillan, and co-editor of Literature and Contemporary Thought at Routledge. Min-Hyung Sung is professor of English and director of the Asian American Studies program at Boston College. He is the author of numerous volumes, among them The Children of 1965 on Writing and Not Writing as an Asian American, which won the Association for Asian American Studies Prize in Literary Criticism and the Alpha Sigma Nu Award in Literature and Fine Arts. His chapter, The Artful Things of Climate Change, in the collection Racial Ecologies, won the Carla Rai Peterson Book Award in Environmental Communication from the National Communications Association. Professor Song's forthcoming book, Climate Lyricism, considers how contemporary poetry and fiction, especially by Black, Native American, Asian American, and Latinx writers, can help readers develop a reading practice that allows them to focus on climate change as an everyday phenomenon. A few words about the structure of our event. We will open with short presentations by each of our three guests about what brought them to writing about climate change and environmental issues. They will then further elaborate on their scholarship in conversation with one another. We will follow up with a few questions from myself and my co-moderator, whom I am very happy to introduce now. A very warm welcome to Israel Hernandez Luna, a PhD candidate in Literature and Cultural Studies in the Spanish department here at Georgetown, and also a member of the newly created Humanities Initiative Student Board. He graduated with honors in Spanish, Hispanic Literatures and Cultural Studies from the University of Illinois at Chicago. His academic research spans 20th and 21st centuries literature and literary theory, philosophical and psychoanalytic approaches to literature, visual arts and history, cosmopolitanism, modernity and postmodernism. His main inquiry is how the other manifests itself in other art forms from the perspective of fiction. In the last portion of our conversation, we will engage with the audience. So please, you're all invited to send your questions and comments at any time through the Q&A function. Please don't use the chat, which has been disabled. And now I'm pleased to hand it over to our first speaker, Professor Sukanya Banerjee. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Nicoletta, and thank you for your invitation. I would like to thank you and also my Victorianist colleague, Nathan Hensley at Georgetown, for this invitation. It is indeed a pleasure to be here, whatever that means in our times, and to join you. And many thanks to Candace Mosley and Israel Luna for helping with this event. So in the short time that I have, I'm actually going to read out some prepared remarks as I told Nicoletta at this point in the semester, and with everything that's been going on, I really don't trust myself in terms of saying something off the cuff or sort of extempore and being very coherent about it. So maybe I will be more coherent if I read something out. The emphasis is on maybe. There are no guarantees. Okay, so the remit for this presentation, as I understand it, is to reflect on how, as literary critics and scholars, we read and write climate. How does reading climate inform our writing? How does our writing address or respond to ecological issues and the climate crisis? I will confess that I have no definitive response to this prompt, for reading climate has opened up more questions than what can be mediated, resolved, or reflected through writing alone. In fact, it seems to me that climate disrupts or throws into question the very relation between reading and writing. We grapple with the incompatibilities of scale, we are befuddled by genre, we are keenly reminded, perhaps more than in any other instance, of the disjunction between materiality and textuality, even as we are startled into acknowledging the materiality of text, paper, ink, fiber optic cables. Climate writing makes us stumble anew at the limits of representation. And yet, I will build today's presentation around a little-known text from the 19th century, the period that I study. My area of research is Victorian Britain and its empire, and I'm particularly interested in the literatures and histories of colonialism, especially with reference to South Asia. One of the signal features of critical environmentalist scholarship has been, as we know, the twinning of colonialism with questions of ecology. And at an academic level, that is my interest in this topic. It is impossible now not to read colonialism without simultaneously reading its ecological imperative or effect. However, even as the ecological turn marks a welcome shift away from the anthropocentric terms of post-colonial analysis, I wonder if the binaristic paradigm of the former, that is to say, its dyadic framing of the colonizer and colonized, is not replicated in some ways in contemporary eco-thinking, inasmuch as that voices often from colonized constituencies, indigenous communities, the global south, are posited in primarily salvific terms as repositories of traditional, alternate, and prior knowledges that are essential, instrumental to our continued planetary survival. This is not in any way to turn away from those knowledges or de-emphasize their importance, and I want to be very clear about that. Rather, it is to consider how we can negotiate a line of inquiry that is sensitive to marginalization or erasure that eco-colonialism has brought about, but a line of inquiry that also does not lapse into an overdetermined process of knowledge retrieval. I don't have any easy model to offer for how we can forge such a line of inquiry, but I will share a text that prompted these questions for me through its internal rhetorical structure. It is also a text that in itself allows us to envisage a wider range of voices on the environment. By wider range, I'm referring to a diverse array of speakers, which is critical. I am also referring to our range of expectations and assumptions of what such voices might prefer. So the text in question is a socioeconomic analysis compiled by Ramesh Chandra Dutt, who was an economist, historian, novelist, and member of the prestigious Indian Civil Service. Now, because it is that point of the semester where you absolutely need yet one more PowerPoint, I am going to share my screen and yeah. So that is a member of the Indian Civil Service. He was one of the very few Indians appointed to the elite ranks of the civil service in the 19th century. But that Dutt gained entrance into the ICS was in no small measure on account of his considerable caste, class, and locational privilege, a positioning that punctuates his observation in this text that I'm briefly going to mention, his 1874 study titled The Peasantry of Bengal. Dutt's objective in this text is to draw attention to the condition of peasants in Bengal, the cultivating class, as he refers to them, who fail to secure legislative redress on account of the fact that the realities of their situation are either unknown or misrepresented to the colonial state, which Dutt alleges is tied in its interests with native landowners. There is much to be said, of course, about the complex configuration of social and political relations. Dutt, the anglicized colonial subject, seeking redress on behalf of peasants from the colonial government of which he is an employee, but which in his view has done more to protect the interests of the landed class than the peasants. Dutt's intervention is obviously occasioned by his awareness of the extent to which colonial power is tied into agricultural interests, an awareness that reminds us of one of the original meanings of the word colony, from Latin colonial, settlement, farm. But Dutt's exposition is also sensitive to the ecological impact of agriculture. When introducing his audience to the peasants, his perspective is that of an urban city dweller. To one who has never been out of town, he says, the prospect of the open country must be striking and pleasant. In describing the landscape of rural Bengal, he distinguishes it from an English one. There are no undulating hills or hedgerows here, he says. He describes instead the, quote, paddy fields spreading their sea-like expanse as far as the eye can reach, with waving corn shining under the golden tints of the morning Indian sun. Here and elsewhere in the paragraph, he uses language that we would describe as poetic, and also that we would associate with the pastoral. But Dutt also seems very aware of the kind of displacement that the pastoral effects. Therefore, even as he ends the extended, sensorially rich paragraph with the comment that a spot so secluded seems devoted to rural peace and happiness, he immediately splits the sentence, disrupting its initial picture of bucolic bliss with the concluding comment that the countryside, alas, is the home of poverty, suffering, and ignorance. This shift will seem unexpected only if we overlook the epigraph to this chapter. The epigraph comprises lines from the English poet George Crabbe's The Village. And, these are the lines that are, prefacing the chapter. Especially, so if you look especially, the last four, on their bare heads and dewy temples play, while some with feebler heads and fainter hearts deplore their fortune yet sustain their parts. Then shall I dare these real ills to hide in tinsel trappings of poetic pride, right? And this is George Crabbe, right? Okay. Done with the PowerPoint. All right. So though using a specific rhyming scheme, as you would have noted in those lines, Crabbe paints nonetheless in the village a rather prosaic picture of village life in as much as he substitutes the lived realities of agricultural life and labor for the idyllic visions of the pastoral. In the village, as in other poems, Crabbe freights his poems with details such that William Hazlitt, amongst others, expressed his distaste for Crabbe's work, finding it difficult to distinguish it from medical reports or legal documents. Yet it is this very turn to an apparently objective truth that appeals to Dutt. Lines from the village, in fact, constitute the epigraph to the book itself, to the peasantry of Bengal. So the epigraph to the book is, I paint the court as truth will paint it and as bards will not. And these were lines that, precede the ones that I just cited. Significantly, in The Country and the City, compiled almost a century after The Peasantry of Bengal was published, Raymond Williams echoes Dutt in citing the same lines from Crabbe in his, that's Williams's, meditation on the pastoral. For Williams, the contrast in Crabbe's mind is not so much between past and present England as between true and false ways of writing. If Crabbe protests the falsehood of poetry, then what he is rejecting, according to Williams, is the idealization of actual English country life and its social and economic realities that the literary convention of the neo-pastoral came to embody. In grouping Crabbe, Dutt, and Williams, it's an unlikely trio, my intent is not to focus on the pastoral per se, but one cannot miss how the literary convention of the pastoral constellates this otherwise unlikely grouping of poet, economist, and critic across centuries and continents. Neither can one miss the extent to which, for each writer, an invocation of the pastoral, signals an evidently fraught relation between environmental truths and imaginative writing. What seems to be at stake is the degree to which the latter can speak to and of ground realities, and more specifically, as far as Dutt is concerned, do so with precision. Small wonder then that Dutt pays homage to Crabbe, for whom precision is both a matter of form, note the rhyming couplets, and content. For Dutt, a pulling back from the pastoral gives him the cue to speak very literally of the ground. In the next paragraph, he attributes the peasants' poor condition partly to their lack of adequate knowledge of appropriate soil management. While the Bengali peasant is adept at soil selection, planting particular kinds of crops according to particular features of the soil, he's apparently not familiar with the principle of crop rotation. Therefore, even as the soil is generally very fertile, it is, Dutt pointed out, depleted of its nutrients. Such ideas of soil management were already extant in the 19th century, so Dutt is hardly a pioneer in this regard. But the remarkable compression of movement that takes us from the golden fields of corn to soil nutrition constitutes what seems to me a key feature of environmental writing itself, in which the technical is interwoven with the imaginative or figural. We need one to make sense of the other. And this is my final paragraph. So what this overlay demands from literary scholars and critics is a denotative reading and writing practice that is attentive to the technical, that asks us, as Elaine Friedgood and Canon Schmidt have pointed out in a wider context, to read literally and not just figuratively. Without putting too fine a point on it, I would also suggest that denotative reading is also a grounding strategy. It re-territorializes or rematerializes space, vivifying the local in ways that speak to non-autochthonous histories and processes. It is perhaps this kind of grounded knowledge that we seek now, not least when we make the turn to the indigenous, the colonized, the global South. But here, Dutt's speaking of and for the peasants opens up some caveats. The peasants have not yet wizened, Dutt suggests, to the benefits of crop rotation. As a reader, I ask, but how does he know that? Maybe they have other modes of soil replenishment. Maybe it's not visible to him, the city dweller. Undergirding these questions is evidently a belief or desire on my part to believe in a self-sustaining ecological system, which we seek under the sign of indigeneity, the colonized, the global South. And these are distinct constituencies, but that turn is the same. But in doing so, I also wonder, if I want the peasantry of Bengal to deliver itself, if we want such knowledges to deliver us, then what 21st century versions of the pastoral are we writing? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sukanya. Now we give the floor to Ursula Heise, and we look forward to hearing from her, and then to Professor Sun.
Thank you, Nicoletta, and I'd like to echo Sukanya's thank you to all the organizers of this event. It's a great honor to be able to be part of this. So your initial invitation was to invite us to think about how we came to write about climate change, or to engage with writing about climate change. And my short answer would be late and reluctantly. And I mean it like this: I've been interested in environmental issues for over 25 years, but I've not been, and I would say even now, I am not particularly interested in climate change. My main interests have been in species taxonomies, human, non-human relations, biodiversity loss, endangered species, and urban ecology. Those are sort of my main areas of passion. And so over the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, I found myself increasingly resisting and brushing up against the current tendency to use climate change as a synecdoche, as a proxy for all environmental issues. And what I found myself doing, somewhat reluctantly, because of course I do think that climate change is an important issue. I just don't think that it is all environmental issues, or that all environmental issues are climate change. So for example, in biodiversity loss, the issue that I've been most concerned with, and the writing about which I've studied in greatest detail, I found myself again and again sort of pushing against the notion that climate change is the major driver of current species extinctions. It is not. It might at some point in a probably fairly distant future become that, but it has not been for the last few hundred years, and it is not now, and it isn't now by a long shot. So just a couple of years ago, I was on a panel about species extinction at the LA County Museum of Natural History, and it was moderated by a very prominent journalist from the Los Angeles Times. Originally, the panel was supposed to be called something like, well, how can current species survive the climate challenge? And I wrote back to the journalist and said, well, I don't think for species right now, climate change is the major challenge. The major challenge is habitat loss. And so we changed the title a little bit, but then it came up again in the discussion, and she still reacted very surprised when I said that, although the other panelists then jumped to my aid and said, no, biodiversity loss is not mostly caused by climate change. The main driver of biodiversity loss is habitat loss. That is the change of land use on the part of humans, the conversion of wild areas to farming areas, of farming areas to urban areas. That's the main driver, followed by pollution, overharvesting, and in some cases, introduction of species from other ecosystems. And climate change is really very distantly behind that. It's just that it's loomed very prominently in some stories that we love to tell about species extinction, the story of the polar bears, who are indeed endangered by climate change, or the story in recent years of multiple genera of corals who are being bleached by ocean acidification, which is itself a consequence of climate change. So there are a few species where that is true, that climate change is a major driver, but for the overwhelming majority of species that are threatened and endangered, climate change is not what they're struggling with, it's loss of habitat. So I found myself pushing back against that in this particular area, but also in other areas that I became acquainted with just by traveling to places like Indonesia or Vietnam, where people don't worry as much about climate change as North Americans and Western Europeans tend to do. Why not? Not because they don't think it's a major problem, but because they don't have access to healthcare. They don't have access to safe housing. In Indonesia, they drink bottled water because the water that comes out of the faucet is not clean enough to drink. And so they're worried about their own and their children's health. So there's a lot of groups and communities in the world for whom climate change is simply not the top priority, even when they're not denying climate change at all, but for whom other problems are predominant. And for Indonesia, so finding a decent sanitation and recycling system arguably would, in the short term, solve more environmental problems than trying to address climate change. So I find myself pushing back, even as I think it's very important. I keep pushing back against the omnipresence of climate change and the way in which climate change is used to refer to all environmental issues, whether they have anything to do with climate change or not. Now, there's a lot of environmental issues like deforestation, like salinization of soils, like wildfires that are made worse by climate change, but many of them actually do not originate from climate change. So I think that's also worth keeping apart. So to the extent that I've engaged with climate change, it has been a little bit reluctantly and against the grain, and to emphasize how climate change interweaves with, but is not identical with other environmental crises that are running concurrently and that I think are better understood as sort of a mesh or network of crises that sometimes converge and sometimes diverge in their effects. In recent years, I found myself engaging with climate change for that reason, and with writing about climate change and the way in which climate change is used as a trope, as a synecdoche, a proxy for all other environmental issues on those grounds. There's also two other reasons that I became interested, particularly in writing about climate change. One of them is my longstanding interest in urban narrative. I've always been interested in the way in which cities are portrayed, and from the early 20th century onward, increasingly by means of narrative that tries to be spatial and simultaneous as much as sequential, and the sort of interesting aesthetic as well as ideological problems that come out of that. Now the city, and it's interesting that Sukanya alluded to Raymond Williams, who of course wrote one of the foundational books on the way in which the difference between country and city in many cultures, and not just Western ones, Japan is another example in which the dichotomy between city and country really stands for, as a proxy itself, for the dichotomy between culture and nature. And for a long time, the city was a stepchild of environmentalism and environmental writing, and also of urban ecology. That's really changed since in urban planning, architecture, and design since the 1990s, and in urban ecology since about the turn of the millennium. There's been an absolute explosion of interest in urban ecology in all of its varied dimensions, from the study of urban biodiversity to water management systems to climate adaptation and so forth. And there's been an even bigger explosion of ideas, paradigms, and practices in urban planning and architecture to deal with these various challenges and to think about nature in the city. And broadly speaking, I think you could say we've moved from thinking in the 1970s about nature in cities, so thinking about green spaces like parks, thinking about blue spaces such as rivers or beaches, and in some cases about gray spaces such as vacant lots, to thinking from the 1990s onward to thinking about nature for cities. That is how we can increase access and equity for green spaces, and thinking about environmental justice in the urban realm, to thinking since about the turn of the millennium or a little later to cities really as a kind of nature. This has come out of the thinking of Australian ecologists like Richard Hobbs, who thought of novel ecosystems as, abandoned farmlands or abandoned mining areas that were once altered profoundly by humans, but then abandoned and left to their own development, which then results not in a return to the ecosystem that existed before, but to the emergence of entirely new ecosystems. But from the start, certain ecologists and geographers also applied the term novel ecosystems to cities, which of course are constantly managed by humans, so they don't correspond to the abandonment part of the definition. But there are ecosystems in their own right, with their own functioning, with their own features, such as the urban heat island effect, with distinctive patterns of vegetation and animal life and so forth. And so in that context, environmental justice has emerged as a major paradigm, the differential access to the benefits of nature and differential exposure to environmental risks, as well as the integration of different systems of knowledge about urban and non-urban nature. So that's become a major focus within urban ecology and urban planning. In terms of thinking about the impacts of anything we might want to do to quote unquote green the city, right? So we're not worrying about green gentrification. If we create a park in a certain area of, say, my hometown of Los Angeles, will that then lead to real estate prices in that area going up and the poorer populations, many of them communities of color, actually being pushed out? So I became really interested in how urban narrative has engaged with climate change. Under the sign of climate urbanism. And one of the things that I've found myself repeatedly writing about in recent years is the central motif of the drowning city. I was struck by the fact of how many novels in either the fictional or non-fictional mode focus on drowning or already flooded cities as major icons of what climate change will do to our current civilization. Nothing wrong with that. Of course, we all know floods and rising sea levels and king tides will in fact imperil coastal cities around the world, but it's nevertheless striking that drought is an equally dangerous prospect for a lot of cities. And we've recently seen Cape Town, Chennai, and Sao Paulo all suffering major droughts and major impacts on urban populations. Yet that comes up in fictional narrative a lot more rarely than drowned cities. So I found myself thinking about, and in film too, I mean, all the way from Roland Emmerich's The Day After Tomorrow to, a Vietnamese film about climate change, Nuoc 2030, which came out in 2014, which is the total opposite stylistically of The Day After Tomorrow, very quiet and lyrical, but focuses on a Saigon, that in the film is still above water, but then in a crucial scene is suddenly shown as drowned in rather surrealist ways. So that hold of the drowned city as a trope that of course goes all the way back to Atlantis and has always symbolized the changing of civilizations, the downfall of even the most powerful empires, the futility of even the most ardent religious beliefs, and so on, has asserted itself and sort of acquired a new reality in these contemporary writings about climate change, and fosters one particular and in general, but not always disaster-driven depiction of climate change. And disaster is sort of the larger genre that I would like to foreground and I would love to discuss with you as the major narrative structure that has sort of driven writing and filming of climate change. Whereas of course, a lot of the changes that climate change brings about are not disastrous in the short term. They're slow, they're gradual, they're often invisible for decades. So I'm really interested in the challenges that poses and how some very successful writers and filmmakers have actually found solutions to that problem. I also found that this motif of the drowned city is not confined to works of speculative fiction or even to fiction period, although it's certainly very prevalent in those texts that are concerned with climate change. You also find it in something like Jeff Goodell's book, The Water Will Come, or Ashley Dawson's Extreme Cities, or David Wells Wallace's The Uninhabitable Earth, where again and again you find, this motif of the drowned city in books that are actually books of sociology, of journalism, of investigation from journalistic and scientific angles of the consequences of climate change. And that brings me to sort of the third thing that has interested me about climate change, is that it, along with some other environmental and social issues, has driven a sort of spillover effect that has introduced central motifs and strategies from science fiction into mainstream fiction, but also into nonfiction. And I found that really fascinating, as probably everybody who's on this meeting knows that a lot of literary and cultural scholars have worried over the last 10 years as to whether narrative in the forms that we've used for the last few hundred years is up to the task of representing climate change, and especially the extended temporal and spatial scales of climate change. So I'm thinking here of Adam Trexler's Anthropocene Fictions, or Timothy Clark's book on the Anthropocene, or Amitav Ghosh on The Great Derangement, where all of them think that the bourgeois realist novel somehow is not capable of dealing with climate change. And by extension, there seems to be an idea that the novel, or maybe even narrative, is not capable of dealing with climate change. So I found myself writing about that, and writing again back against that assumption, which I think is wrong, because it leaves out the enormous temporal and spatial scales that are absolutely routine in the genre of science fiction, which is admittedly in many of its instantiations not the mainstream bourgeois realist novel, but it has been an important genre for 150 years now. And it's surprising to me to the extent to which a very, very perceptive writer and scholar such as Amitav Ghosh seems unable to say anything about science fiction as one of the most important genres to actually address and encompass these enormous temporal scales. So books that span narrative plots that span millions or even billions of years, were introduced, of course, by H.G. Wells in The Time Machine, where the time traveler goes 800,000 years into the future, continued by Brian Stapleton, who wrote a couple of books that the first of which, A First and Last Men, spans 2 billion years. So, and many others lately that, in science fiction span thousands of years, sometimes tens of thousands of years. So there just is no problem with time scale for the novel or for narrative, so far as I can tell. Neither is there a problem with spatial scale. I mean, people have written about other planets and about galaxies and about travel through galaxies for quite a while. So we can do all of that, although I take seriously Timothy Clark's concern that once you shift scale, you shift to a different kind of agent, and that the agents that occupy these novels might not be the ones that most interest a contemporary audience, especially contemporary American audience. But I think that's framing the problem in a very different way. Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction novelist, has called science fiction the realism of our time. And to some extent, I agree with that. I think science fiction does have an inventory of narrative strategies that are very well suited precisely to dealing with contemporary problems. So science fiction has been sort of the third way in which I have become interested in climate change and writing about climate change. And Kim Stanley Robinson has stood out to me as one of the few writers among the currently living ones who dares to imagine not utopias, but what he calls optopias, best you can get given circumstance for the future. So I've been a little bit downcast by the overwhelming majority of dystopian, apocalyptic, and post-apocalyptic scenarios in science fiction that deals with climate change, because I think that genre used to have a certain power that I believe it has at this point lost. I don't think it really incites most people to action or to the imagination of an alternative future anymore. So to me, the really exciting question is what other kinds of writing might induce us to think about the future in constructive terms and to imagine futures that will carry us, and by us I mean not just humans, but also the non-humans that co-inhabit the planet with us into the future. And so I'd be happy in the discussion to give a few examples of what the challenges are with imagining these kinds of futures, and a few authors and filmmakers who I think have succeeded in doing that.
Thank you very much. I am happy to give the floor to Professor Song now.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Really, thank you for the invitation and Georgetown for hosting this event. And I want to thank everyone who came to this event, because I'm amazed that you can stand another Zoom meeting at this time of the semester. I don't know about you, but I am all Zoomed out. It's an honor also to be on this panel with Sukanya and Ursula. And my work kind of fits in between theirs. And I have a few comments that I have prepared, because like Sukanya, I just don't trust myself to be as lucid extemporaneously as Ursula just showed us how to do that. I can't do that. So I'm gonna just try to make a few quick comments. First and foremost, I want to say about myself that I'm a scholar of race and racism who's interested in thinking about definitions of race that aren't just black and white. This interest comes out of the fact of my own experience as an immigrant from Korea who grew up in Detroit and its suburbs during the 1970s and 1980s. To live in southeastern Michigan during this time was to be a witness to how race fractured the landscape, permeated every social relationship, and defined the horizon of what was possible and what was desirable. There was never a time during my youth, nor in my adulthood, when I didn't think of my own status as a racial minority. This also has meant that I didn't give a lot of thought to nature or to environmentalism in my teens or 20s, or really well into my 30s. I didn't read a lot of Thoreau or Jewett or Abbey or Muir or Carson. I didn't spend a lot of time outdoors. My family didn't go hiking or camping, and I didn't do those things when I was living on my own. Well, not much anyway. The pastoral and the bucolic are not, for me, compelling modes of aesthetic experience. Indeed, to this day, I prefer living in the city to living in the suburb or the country. And my idea of an ideal vacation is to visit another city. And to be honest, I distrust invocations of nature because they seem premised on essentialist notions of how the facts of the world are given rather than co-constructed by humans. To claim that something is natural, it always seemed to me, is to deny the social processes that are always at work, shaping everything that we can know and perceive. You could say I'm kind of a hard social constructionist that way, but I do believe that racial differences are not natural. Gender is not natural. Built landscapes are not natural. Even forests and streams and meadows are not natural. And I've carried this distrust of nature into my research when I turn to the topic of climate change. I have a new book coming out in January that's solely focused on climate change and literature. But despite what I've just said, I also have to admit that I've been long concerned about global warming, which is what everyone used to call it when I was in college in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Perhaps climate change or global warming attracted me because there's obviously nothing natural about it. Global warming's central and overriding premise is that it is anthropogenic. I still recall a passionate and long conversation I had with a friend as a first-year college student. One of those late nights when we got real and about what we knew and what we feared, and we spoke all about global warming gases that were accumulating in the atmosphere and their likely effects on the climate. We talked about what conditions would likely be once we reached our middle age, which we are at now. This conversation took place in the fall of 1988, just a few months after James Hansen gave his famous testimony in front of the US Congress when he declared climate change is already happening now, or I guess he would have said global warming is already happening now. We had also both lived through a historically hot summer with blistering temperatures over 90 degrees, descending Fahrenheit, descending on the Midwest in the first 2 weeks of July, and then again in August. So global warming was on my mind throughout the 1990s and beyond, when the Chicago heat wave of 1995 took the lives of over 700 people. I remember reading newspaper accounts obsessively, and I was in graduate school at the time and could not afford an air conditioner. And I was feeling what it felt like to be in the midst of a heat wave. And to this day, of all of the kind of environmental concerns that we have around climate change, my greatest concern, my greatest fear are heat waves. I think those are underestimated, the kind of impact they have. I remember paying close attention to Eric Kleinenberg's Heat Wave, a social autopsy of disaster in Chicago, as soon as it came out. And I remember reading the news with disbelief when the 2003 European heat wave took over 70,000 lives. Never once did I doubt that such sensational events were related in some direct way to global warming. But then again, neither of these events moved me to center climate change or environmentalism in my research. What did alter the course of my thinking and of my writing was Hurricane Katrina in 2005. So many of my colleagues who study contemporary American literature and culture get really, especially in this century, get really hooked on 9/11 or the 2008 financial crisis. And for obvious reasons, they're really important events. But I think just as important and just as significant is Hurricane Katrina. And we might want to use that also as a marker for thinking about our entry into this century, at least in the US. There are maybe three reasons for this in my own thinking. First, Katrina demonstrated the power of the superstorms that are growing stronger and more destructive. While some scientists debated at the time whether or not strengthening storms were associated to global warming, I think few would have that debate today. To put it simply, warming oceans mean stronger winds. And even for us who are non-scientists, it should all be too obvious that the world has entered into a period of superstorms. In addition to wildfires, derechos, droughts, sunny day flooding, polar vortexes, and so on and so forth. So Katrina, it seems to me, was a kind of announcement that such a period had formally begun. And what was once extraordinary before Katrina has since become commonplace. So that's number one. Another reason why I think Katrina has acted as a kind of pivot for my own thinking is how much it revealed race and wealth to be a factor in who is made vulnerable to increasing extreme weather events, as opposed to others who are somewhat shielded from harm. And I'd say somewhat, they're not completely shielded, but somewhat shielded from harm by the ability, in this case, to move elsewhere and find shelter in relatively comfortable conditions. So in New Orleans alone, where most of the attention was focused, you really saw in movies and books, especially films like When the Levees Broke or Trouble the Water, how African Americans in particular suffered the most losses. Their homes were flooded. Many of their lives were lost. And the victims, who were largely African American, were demonized in the first wave of reporting as looters and thugs and lawless criminals. And what that event taught us, and taught the people who suffered the most in particular, is that not only was the federal government not going to come to the aid of the poor and non-white populations during an emergency, but that these same people were going to be represented in the most unflattering way, that it was their fault for their own suffering. And this is unfortunately a pattern that remains with us today. Just consider what happened to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. This takes me to a third and slightly more technical issue, and that is anyone who has spent time reading the scholarship on biopolitics and necropolitics. For those people, Katrina must stand out as a chilling example of how some lives are considered valuable and worth extending as much as possible, while other lives are considered expendable, or worse, a danger that needs to be eliminated. These kinds of calculations seem to be operating on the surface when it was decided that some parts of the city of New Orleans would be situated in lower lying areas near neglected levees. And when the people who were most vulnerable were encouraged to find shelter in the Superdome and the Convention Center, where they were abandoned during those long, hot, muggy days right after the storm. It's these same kinds of calculations that were on the surface when efforts to rebuild the city got underway. Who was encouraged to return to New Orleans? Where did the money go to rebuild the city? What happened to the schools? From everything I've read, New Orleans became an experiment in neoliberal reform. This was a chance to remake a city along those lines of privatized markets. These calculations, these biopolitical and necropolitical calculations, were also at work in the centering of New Orleans in public discussions about the effects of Katrina, as other parts of the Gulf Coast were largely ignored by the press. I had to read literary works like Jasmine Ward's Salvage the Bones or Natasha Trethewey's Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, to really grasp what the impact of the storm was on the other Gulf Coast. And this lacuna in reporting and attention and awareness of the destructiveness of Katrina makes me wonder as well about all the stories that are now not being told in places like Puerto Rico, the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the Philippines, or Bangladesh and West Bengal, especially after Hurricane Amphan. These are all the areas that have, in the last few years, been ravaged by superstorms. I guess it's actually Cyclone Amphan. The names are always confusing to me why some places are typhoons and cyclones and hurricanes, but they're basically the same kind of storm. So why Katrina? Why focus on Katrina? Why was it a pivot for me? For me, Katrina made most evident that the topic of climate change is an urgent concern for the study of race and racism. And in many ways, I believe we are also in the middle of the story. And whether we realize it or not, the racism we are experiencing in this country and elsewhere is part of the story. What this also means is that whatever it might seem inevitable about our present to those living several decades from now, just don't seem that inevitable to us right now. I really believe that anything can happen, especially in this decade. And that one of the things holding us back from engaging with the many challenges associated with climate change and racism is the limits of our own imagination. We just can't imagine how bad things can get. Our worst case scenarios just aren't bad enough. And we can't convince ourselves that we can actually make better worlds. And not just better worlds, but stupendously, wildly, deliriously better worlds. It's intense to try to open up the horizons of our imagination in this way, to see the range of what's possible as occupying such extremes. It's much safer and easier to assume some middle ground and to live on with an impoverished imagination. So the way I understand our job as critics and academics, at least provisionally, is to hew to the more difficult path and to insist on occupying a present of terrifying possibilities for what the future holds for us. Our worst case scenarios need to be more terrifying. And our best case scenarios need to be more utopic. And we shouldn't think there's some safe middle of greatest likelihood. Anything is possible now. A lot of radically different pathways radiate from the present with equal plausibility. In order to imagine such possibilities, we need to think about how race affects whatever responses there may be to the environmental challenges facing all of us. And we also have to think hard about the ways in which the worsening effects of climate change will exacerbate present-day racisms with potentially cascading political consequences. In short, there's no way to imagine the kind of best case scenarios surrounding climate change that we need to imagine into being without also imagining greater racial equality and justice. So these thoughts beg the question for me, what terrifies us most? The worst case scenarios or the idea of making the better world or the world better? The latter, after all, requires more from us, while the worst case scenarios require nothing from us. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the three of you for three compelling presentations. There are so many connections, and I'm pretty sure that each of you has remarks or questions to start a conversation. So please feel free to begin, and we look forward to hearing your additional remarks before we jump in with our own questions. Who wants to start?
I could begin, I guess. I want to ask you, Sukanya. I mean, I thought it was really interesting, actually, that your presentation and mine kind of touched on the tradition of the pastoral, and I guess Ursula's as well touches on that. So maybe it'd be really interesting to just think about why in some ways we feel the need to discuss it at all, the pastoral, why it seems to be something that we can't ignore, even if we want to say it doesn't really work well for us. At least that's my case.
Yeah, I mean, mine too. I mean, the point where I ended is precisely that we don't write our own versions. So what is it about the hold of the pastoral is what you're saying, and why does that so? What is the immediacy, to kind of question the immediacy with which it suggests itself to us when we think about environmental writing, right? Is the I think sort of what's driving your question. I mean, for me, it was kind of the recurrence across these three very different texts. So there's something to be said for the portability of literary conventions, and so thinking about if you're talking about a range and sort of a connecting factor. I mean, so that is something that we can't entirely jettison. Right, in terms of, and here I don't mind talking about the instrumentality of certain kinds of literary tropes or conventions,
But I was just thinking with the with George Crabbe's The Village. I mean, it's at once like it's more a kind of critique of the pastoral poetic tradition than it is an example of it, right? I mean,
absolutely.
The whole poem is just, in many ways, it seems like Crabbe and Dutt are similarly, enacting a particular, maybe creating a kind of counter genre to the pastoral, which is actually just another form of the pastoral, which is to question it, maybe offer a kind of Georgic response to it, by emphasizing the labor that goes into maintaining that kind of landscape.
Yeah.
I think it might also have to do with our search for alternatives to the idealization of wild nature, especially in North America, or maybe only in North America. It's actually rather atypical of environmental movements in the rest of the world. But it's pushing back against the idea that the best nature is untouched nature. So we're going back to pastoral in some sense as a kind of writing that did present to us humanly altered landscape as beautiful and not just as destructive. And I've sort of found myself recently thinking about the way in which there might be parallels between pastoral and the recent recuperations of traditional ecological knowledge, TEK. There's a really interesting series called Tending the Wild on KCET TV that does that sort of for the Western United States and talks about sort of practices of cultural burning, basketry, medicinal usage, and some of which are being, of course, now reclaimed and converge with contemporary science. And I found myself thinking, well, is that sort of a new version of pastoral, or is it an alternative version of Georgic? In the sense that it emphasizes, and some of the Native American interviewees actually say explicitly, nature is a garden that you have to tend, or nature is like a house. If you don't tend it, then it'll fall apart. If you don't do the maintenance, things will go out of whack and it'll go down the drain. So I'm also wondering whether the endurance of pastoral, not in its classical visions, but in all of the many post-pastoral, neo-pastoral versions, we're looking for models for how to think, what you alluded to, I mean, how we think about human transformations and human work within nature.
So that makes me think. I'm sorry, go ahead, Sukanya.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I find that an interesting possibility, though. Personally, I really like actually the classical pastoral tradition much more than the later versions of it. So I actually really enjoy reading Virgil and reading the Eclogues in particular. I think they're just beautiful poems and idyllic, and offers a really complicated vision of the pastoral landscape as both the kind of middle landscape between the wild and the urban, which is, I guess, today our suburbs, but also, and more importantly, as a kind of temporary refuge, a place where you can find a little peace between your troubles. It doesn't seem to me quite the same kind of pastoral you're describing, which is a kind of attempt to transform the Western United States into a kind of managed garden.
But in both those cases, I mean, Min, what you're talking about, and Ursula, in your rendition, I mean, there is that, I don't know, that impulse, perhaps, to return, you know, that sense of, you know, you talked about a resting place or a refuge or a return or a restoration. And, you know, that in a way kind of undergirds sort of a lot of the critical, or not the critical, maybe the activist energies of, you know, a lot of the work on environmentalism. And that is something kind of, you know, you want to think about how that is framed.
I guess I'm very skeptical about narratives of return that could, you know, go back to an era. And I think maybe we're all on the same page on this. That you know, that there's any possibility we could go back to a state of wilderness or of a kind of pristine time before. It seems to me that that is a really destructive idea, and if we try to pursue those ideals, it's really going to lead to all sorts of ruin.
Yeah, I agree. I am in general very skeptical of notions of, you know, return or restoration for all sorts of reasons. But yeah, there is kind of a notion of sort of that holistic of, you know, kind of a holistic reclamation of the possibility, howsoever receding. And even if there is an acknowledgement of its impossibility, it is that which, you know, catalyzes or, you know, triggers that move. I mean, it is a strong counterpoint to loss.
Professor Hayes, hi. I was wondering, changing like a little bit the topic about the drowning cities, right? That you were talking about, and it make me thought, you know, like no, it wasn't a drowning city per se, but the letters of Hernan Cortés that sent the king to Spain when they discovered Tenochtitlan, right? And how it was this this landscape being changed, you know, from nature to build a urban city, very powerful, and how, you know, like the colonized point of view, you know, like how they see it and how they represent it through letters against the representations of the Indians in codex, you know, like they have their codex and stuff. So I wonder, what were you you know, like your thoughts of that?
I think it's a somewhat different imagination of the drowned city, where I think for Cortés it was not obvious how that was actually a functioning urban ecology. I mean, that was something that had been created by the Aztecs, and that actually worked as a city in the middle of a lake, right? So that was a perfectly functioning urban ecosystem that required a lot of maintenance, and that under the Spanish occupation then actually quickly became fetid and pathogenic, right? So they did not understand how it works. To me, it's a little bit analogous to the ecological misunderstandings that also happened in North and South America when Europeans arrived. That, you know, some of the first European settlers in Brazil talked about, oh, how wonderful it was that there were forests that you could just walk into and pick fruit, and how this was this cornucopia nature that was providing this, or vice versa, you know, in British or East Coast or German descended settlers arriving in California and thinking it was desert, which some of it is, but a lot of it is actually not. It's semi-arid in a way that Spaniards actually understood, but people from other parts of Europe or from the East Coast did not. And so introduced regimes of management that did not match the ecology, like the suppression of burning, for example. So I see Hernan Cortés sort of a little bit along those lines, that it was a misunderstanding of something that I think to some degree qualifies as traditional ecological knowledge, although in the case of Tenochtitlan, in a very urbanized context, where for all of the shortfalls of Aztec civilization and culture otherwise, but they had managed to create a very effective urban water management and sanitation system that the Spanish conquerors did not understand. Is that what you're talking about, or am I talking past your question?
No, no.
I'm actually very, very interested in these ecological misunderstandings, which are cultural misunderstandings. That is, you think the right way of dealing with a particular kind of nature is such and such, and you come then in the course of colonialism in contact with different ecosystems, and you transfer these practices and they don't work. I mean, that was essentially what happened, you know, in the Western United States, where essentially German-derived forest management practices, which relied on fire suppression, which makes every bit of sense actually in Germany, but doesn't make any sense in the fire-dependent ecosystems of the American West, were transferred and actually led to some of the disastrous and very large-scale and intense wildfires we have now, and where, you know, cultural burning techniques had to be reintroduced. And my understanding of the situation in Tenochtitlan is that there was a substantial deterioration of that urban water management and sanitation system after the arrival of the Spaniards, because they just didn't know how to manage it, and they didn't let the people who knew how to manage it, right?
Thank you. I see questions from the audience. I want to make sure that we address them. They're very interesting. So I start with the first one that arrived, addressing the question that Sukanya Banerjee raised about the tendency and the risks of positioning some people's knowledge to be salvific. This colleague of ours is working on disability and climate change. And so coming from a somewhat different direction, she's reflecting on the urgency she feels to draw attention to the ways that disabled people have particular knowledge, expertise, and adaptability that might, and I quote, save or benefit wider communities, in part because of the overwhelming political and social marginalization that disabled people face in a world that often devaluates them. But the question also presents another aspect, the idea of resisting this move, because it risks making people's lives and practices valuable only insofar as they can be good, quote unquote, for majority cultures. So essentially, it would be interesting to know more about how you, Sukanya, but also the other two colleagues, navigate this political question, navigating the challenge of both honoring and analyzing marginalized knowledge of minoritized communities, while not framing this work in instrumental terms. I think also Ming Song might have something to say, considering his concern for class, race, gender. So this is the question.
Thank you so much for that question. And you know, I'll take a stab at it, and Min and Ursula, I'm sure, have more to add to it. So, I mean, to me, it seems, you know, I don't have a, you know, fully thought out answer to this. This is something that I'm asking and trying to work out myself too. But you know, for me, it's important how we frame that knowledge and on what terms we take that knowledge. Are we kind of seeing that knowledge as kind of whole, continuous, unproblematized, or are we giving it its due history and its historicity and looking at its lapses, at its problems too. So in other words, not to kind of deify or sort of fetishize knowledge and the subject in question. I think that's very important to kind of in terms of how we approach the knowledge. Whereas if you kind of think of something as functioning as an instrumental good, we tend to have sort of very extractionist mode of kind of thinking about it. And I want to just pause here and say, just because I know Elizabeth Miller, I saw she was on the participants list, and I don't know if she's still here, but she has a very wonderful book coming out in the fall on extraction economy. So I just wanted to sort of give a shout out for that. But in general, in terms of speaking about sort of how we kind of, on what terms do we study or accept or take the knowledge is how I would begin the discussion, the conversation.
I certainly agree that extraction is a really important concern to think about, and thinking about maybe alternative modes of relating to the environment are crucial. I do feel mixed about the ways in which indigenous populations often figure in conversations about alternatives to extractive industry. I've long, and I'm still thinking this through, so I'm just thinking out loud with you, but I have been long concerned by the ways in which indigenous ways of life are often held up as precisely salvic, that they're going to save us, that we haven't gotten very far from that public service announcement many of us grew up with, where the picture of the American Indian, seeing the pollution that the US has created and has a tear in his eye, is a very famous commercial. I feel like maybe we haven't gotten that far from that moment in the ways in which indigenous populations are treated somehow as congruent with nature and has a kind of privileged insight to the management of the land. I really like Richard Powers' novel. I think it's really powerful. His novel, The Overstory, which got a lot of attention. I write a lot about it actually in my book. But I'm also very disappointed by it. And especially I found the ending, I'm always puzzled by the ending. There's an artist who's creating a kind of wildlife installation where he's rearranging timber to create the word still. And just some random indigenous people show up and start helping him, and he doesn't have to explain anything. They don't get a name, they don't get to say anything. They just show up and they just intuit what he's doing and help him out. And there's a way in which I think it's supposed to bolster the sense in which the artist is in tune, right, and maybe going in the right direction with his artwork. And I find that kind of romanticization of indigenous people to be incredibly troubling, maybe even just outright racist in some ways. And I much prefer the kind of treatment and questioning about the relationship between nature and indigeneity that you find in a poem like Tommy Pico's Nature poem, one of my favorite works of literature of late, and just really brilliant in the ways in which he sort of like thinks through that issue. And I think there's one other issue maybe that I think is really worth highlighting, and something I'm puzzled about or puzzling over. And that was what Ursula was saying about how the US might be unique in some ways in its kind of idealization of the wild that you don't really see in as many other countries. And one reason for that, I suspect, is that when European settlers arrived in the Americas, they brought with them an extraordinary amount of disease, and a lot of the population died out. The indigenous population died out as a result of being exposed to new forms of pathogens and infectious diseases. And so what happened in North America in particular, it seems, is that the rapid depopulation of the indigenous population meant that the kind of active management, from the fire ecologies in particular that they were practicing stopped happening. And suddenly there was this wild growth. Some scientists a couple of years back even proposed that the Little Ice Age of the 17th century was caused by the rapid growth of forests in North America, which was a direct result of the rapid depopulation of the indigenous population as caused by European settlement. And so these European settlers arrive in North America in particular, and they find this dense forestry, and for them, this is the wild. But it's actually not the wild, it's actually the ruins of another population that they've directly been responsible for creating, right? They've ruined this population, they led to its rapid depopulation, and this is the result. And it's that result that becomes then later kind of idealized as the wild. And I just kind of want to be mindful of these kind of historical processes and ironies and the many misunderstandings that have happened, that continue, I think, to shape and form our ideas of nature and our attitudes toward indigeneity. I really feel very strongly, actually, that Indigenous studies is one of the really most important kind of academic discourses that we have today.
Thank you. I can conflate two questions, both reflecting upon literary form and their function in climate writing. One is about the resistance, allegedly, to imaginative literature, including science fiction, when it comes to thinking the climate emergency. The other one focuses on the issue of the pastoral as a form. What 21st century versions of pastoral are rewriting, Sukanya asked. And the question is, what kind? They would like to know more about this question, at least from a speculative point of view. And also going back to what Ursula was pointing out about the omnipresence of climate change, might this not constitute its own form of pastoral? So both questions, or let's say three developments revolving around the issue of particular literary forms. Who wants to answer?
I'd be happy to take the first question about science fiction or speculative fiction. And I apologize, I'll have to hop off. I have another meeting in about 5 minutes, since the day is not yet over here in California. So I actually don't agree with the premise of the question. I don't think there is a resistance to speculation in climate science, and especially popular climate science writing. I think there's actually a profusion of books that integrate elements of science fiction. James Hansen's Storms of My Grandchildren, Alan Wiseman's The World Without Us, Bill McKibben's Earth, Making a Life on a New Planet, right? And David Walls-Wallace's The Uninhabitable Earth, A Story of the Future. So, I mean, nonfiction writers have included science fiction. I mean, I think a lot of the stories, what's come to be called cli-fi, a lot of it is science fiction, not all of it, and that's one problem with the term. But a lot of it is speculative, and you could argue that, some parts of the IPCC reports are in fact a form of speculative fiction. I mean, there are predictions of what might happen in the future if X, Y, and Z, and there's distinctions we want to draw. I'm totally on board with that. But it is also true that a lot of climate science actually hovers right on the edge of speculative fiction.
I agree totally with that. I think the IPCC sees use of representative climate pathways is a speculative enterprise. Given these conditions, this is what you would expect, and they are built on a model of speculative narration. It's also, I think, true that if you talk to a lot of climate journalists or follow them on social media, what you find is that they are active fans of speculative fiction and of hard science fiction. I think the work that often gets like the most excitement and the most attention from the climate scientists that I follow online is actually the television series based on the book series The Expanse, which imagines humans traveling, expanding out into the solar system. And what makes it sort of unique and interesting is that the depiction of the human colonization on Earth is one of incredible constraint, where people really have to deal with, challenging physical issues, like how do you exist in zero gravity, and how do you produce food, and how do you maintain like a ready oxygen supply, and there's also these geopolitical considerations, so that it functions almost in the same way as a kind of model for trying to imagine how humans might try to survive under really harsh ecological conditions. And the expansion itself is motivated by the kind of climate change ravages that have happened to Earth, that people can't function anymore without the resources from space, because we've just messed up the planet so much, or at least the people in that world. So I think it's actually a really long and established tradition. Even like maybe 20, 30 years ago, Constance Penley wrote a really great book called NASA Trek. It was a really terrific book where she looked at the relationship between NASA and Star Trek and how they were kind of informing each other. And it was actually a really brilliant reading of their relationship and the ways in which science fiction continued and continues to inform after a lot of scientific activity, and vice versa. Obviously, a lot of science fiction writers are constantly paying attention to what happens to science. And so, I mean, I think I really admire Amitav Ghosh and his work, especially his nonfiction work. I think he's coming up with, he's writing a new book that I think is just really going to be amazing. I've heard bits of it and it's really impressive. But one of his blind spots is the distinction, the hard distinction he makes between literary fiction and genre fiction, especially his, I don't know how else to put it, his utter contempt for science fiction. You talk to him for a few minutes about science fiction, and he makes it very clear to you that he has very, very low opinions of that genre. And it shows in his work. And I think it's unfortunate because it fails to capture how important a medium it is for us now, or a mode, or whatever you want to call it, and how much it, like Kim Stanley Robinson said, it really does act now as a kind of realism of the present, and certainly, it's hard to contemplate actually the kind of enormous changes to the planet that climate change is creating without feeling in some ways like, you have entered into a bad science fiction novel, not even a good one, like a really bad one. It's like a really bad premise. And then how do people deal with that? I think it really helps if you've read a lot of science fiction to grapple with the kinds of changes we're seeing all around us.
Thank you. We are approaching 6:30. Maybe we can squeeze in one last question from the audience, which seems to continue the discussion about form and the connections with other social and ethnic issues that you have addressed. I was wondering, the question says, how literary narratives, Victorian, contemporary, Asian American, articulate a particular positionality of the beholder, who observes and aestheticizes nature. And if there's any attempt to challenge the distance or the separation between nature and its beholder, the culture/nature binary, or the human non-human binary that sustained colonialism and progressive modernization. I'm sure that in your scholarship you have addressed many nuances of this. If you want to maybe reply, and then unfortunately we have to bring the event to a close.
Sukanya, do you want to try to answer the question first?
Yeah, I'm going to take a minute. I'm just reading the question. So Min, if you have something on the ready, go for it.
Sure, I got a couple of thoughts. I think there's intense experimentation in novels and especially in poetry in thinking through the question of perspective and our relationship to the environment. Much of it, I think, grows out of like new materialist modes of thinking that is emphasizing, the ways in which humans and nature are entangled and form into assemblages. There's several keywords like that come up again and again. And I think in particular, the figure that I really admire is Anna Singh and her work. I think it's brilliant. Her mushroom at the end of the world. It's kind of a study of the matsutake mushroom. It's just one of the really most brilliant books I've read. And you see a lot of writers actually reading this kind of material and transforming it into narratives, both in poetry and in fiction. I think a really great example of how some of this is done is actually an Indonesian American writer who wrote a book called, let me just look at this. It's called Bangkok Wakes to Rain by Pichia Sudbanthod. And it's a fragmented narrative. It's nonlinear. There's multiple characters, lots of perspectives, different stories. It's set in the far past. It's set into the near future. You see something like Nemwali Serpal also, The Old Drift, is something very similar. So there's a lot of fracturing of perspective, multiple narratives, a kind of fusing of time, a refusal to engage in kind of linear progressive narratives. You see that also, that kind of intense experimentation, even when it's not about climate fiction or climate change, it still nevertheless, I think, allows a kind of formal experimentation that allows us to imagine the issues of climate change in really important ways. I think Fernanda Melchor's Hurricane Season is another really good example of someone who's experimenting narratively with this kind of formal experiments that's really challenging our ideas about our relationship to our surroundings and to each other. Poetry is just full of examples, and I won't even give you the list because it's too long, but there's just a lot of really terrific stuff happening there as well. And so there's definitely a lot of people who are interested in working through this. For me, and actually for my book, what I'm really concerned about is actually recovering ideas about a shared agency, a shared human agency, because I think one of the challenges, one of the risks in the new materialist modes of thinking is a kind of evacuation of the human from the story, as if we ourselves have no part to play in the mess we've been so actively creating, or at least many of the elite have been actively creating, and the rest of humanity having to suffer through. And I think it's a real problem, actually, in those new materialist modes of thought, as compelling as it is, that they are so suspicious of the human and of ideas of agency. And I think what I'm really interested in is in literary forms and literary experimentation that gives us access back to models of collective agency and a collective togetherness capable of addressing the very serious challenges we all face.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that by talking about how, very briefly, I mean, the notion of how we kind of study backdrop, when we kind of think about the beholder or the, or the narrator and the work that's being done on the notion of the backdrop is something that kind of complicates precisely what you're asking, June. And hi, I think that question's from June. And also, I mean, just in terms of, Victorian literature, one of the things that, when I teach in terms of kind of the rematerialized backdrop, the kind of the vibrant backdrop, right, which is about distributed agency, but also speaks to that question that Min posed, where, you also want to push back against that completely flattened, right, ontology, or what is the place of the human? I'm the figure whose work I found very interesting in kind of addressing these questions is if you teach Kipling's Jungle Books, That it kind of poses this as a problematic, and that is sort of one place where I found it productive to ask these questions.
Thank you. I wish this conversation could go forever, because there are so many issues that emanate naturally from your work and your exchanges today. But I guess, unfortunately, we have to close. I just wish to offer a few remarks emerging also from what has developed through this conversation. We have understood that our relationship with the natural world is deeply informed by history, by culture, by social relationships and values. Society's environmental challenges frequently originate from the ways in which people relate to each other, how we think about environmental problems and the environment itself. I've thought a lot about crisis, which has emerged rather intensely from this conversation. Crises are etymologically turning points, hence we can extrapolate even crossroads, opportunities for encounters and intersections. And you, all of you, through your attention to language, to writing, and to imagination, have highlighted tensions that are challenging, but also productive. You invite us to reinvent what it means to be human and to rethink the relationships between the human and the natural world in different contexts and communities. And last but not least, which is crucial for us in environmental humanities and humanities at large, you have allowed us to appreciate the central role of the humanities in everyday reality, their intellectual, their aesthetic, and ethical responsibility. So thank you again very much, and hopefully see you next year as we will continue this series of events. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the wonderful audience and the patience. We went beyond time, but it was worthwhile. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.